If you ever took a sex ed class in school, it may have felt like this.
Okay, guys, no questions.
Awkward. And you probably didn't learn as much as you hoped.
Like, no, you didn't really get your information from the gym teacher.
I brought some charts.
Well, if you had it awkward, imagine how it was a century ago when people learned all about
Sex.
Sex.
This is the history of sex education. We all learn at some point. It's just a matter of how.
Sex education happens to everybody, to all 7 billion people.
This is John Zimmerman. He wrote a book about the global history of sex ed.
It is too hot to handle. Questions of sex touch on our most intimate sense of ourselves, and it's inevitable, I think, that we're going to clash about it.
You're disrupting the class, get out.
Seriously?
Yes, seriously, go.
He can't say penis in sex ed, sir.
I'm sorry, okay?
There's not much evidence of public sex ed before the early 1900s. Sex is mostly talked about at home, or discouraged entirely. This book from a Massachusetts reverend in 1835 calls masturbation a secret sin that can cause memory loss and a weak mind.
Very bad. Very, very bad.
In 1873, the Comstock Law actually makes it illegal to buy, sell, or even mail any obscene materials in the US. It's not until the social hygiene movement that things start to change. The Victorian era is ending, and marriage rates are down. People see high rates of venereal disease in middle-class white men as proof that sex work is rampant and society is falling apart. So, in 1913, amid all this fear, a group called the American Social Hygiene Association forms in Buffalo, New York. Their mission is to fight sexually transmitted infections through education.
In the schools, they start having first informal talks by physicians that are very much oriented towards these negative consequences, STDs and pregnancy.
Ella Flagg Young in Chicago is the first educator to bring this to schools. As superintendent, she creates the first sex ed program in the US, and at least 20,000 students attend. But it doesn't last long before being shut down by opposition.
No one will talk to students about their private lives.
The ideas are already out there, though, and in 1914, the first sex ed film is released. It's scary. A man gets syphilis, passes it on to his newborn baby, and hints at a grim ending.
You make sex sound terrifying.
But the film keeps growing in popularity. The US Army even uses it in training camps during World War I.
The fear, of course, is that soldiers are going to get infected and terrible things will happen after that and will hurt the war effort. So there was a very explicit campaign led by the War Department to try to prevent that.
The military ends up discharging over 10,000 troops who get sick with STIs. So in 1918, Congress takes a drastic measure. An act called the American Plan dedicates millions in federal funds to fight venereal disease.
World War I is its own special case because, of course, the federal government got involved, right? And something that's really important to understand, for everybody to understand, is that before the Civil Rights Revolution, the federal government did not have a hand in K-12 schools.
The new law has two big goals: educate teachers about STIs and crack down on sex work. Sex workers are seen as a threat to the troops, and this law gives the military power to detain any woman within 5 miles of a base, force her to be tested for STIs, and send her into quarantine at a hospital or farm colony.
Very progressive.
The Army's Social Hygiene Division even puts out these problematic posters. Meanwhile, groups like the ASHA are busy ramping up their own campaigns on the home front, this time aimed at teenage boys to promote self-control and staying away from immoral girls.
We must never have sex again.
The ASHA also starts sponsoring educational films, like this one in 1920, meant for high school and college students. But these are painfully scientific and never mention people actually having sex. Experts see these films as
The so-called plumbing aspect.
Yeah, like learning how pipes work.
Because when you get into the moral aspects and the ethical and the social ones, which is the only thing that kids care about, there's just not enough consensus.
His video is not talking about safe sex at all.
But this is the roaring 20s, and attitudes around sex and relationships are changing fast.
I'm down if you are.
By the start of World War II, Hollywood gets involved. The US Army teams up with directors like John Ford, the guy famous for making all these westerns.
Stand aside, Martin.
He releases this film in 1941.
The Army recognizes the risks present with a large number of men in the
satisfaction of their sexual impulse.
And it becomes one of the most watched sex ed films of all time. The US is also amassing diplomatic power during the war.
That's where you see Americans really trying to promote sex ed and assist the development of sex ed in other countries. What you also see, of course, is decolonization, which means there are more independent countries creating their own policies. So the sex ed landscape becomes much more dense and much more complex after the Second World War.
But when soldiers start coming home,
how jubilant was the taste of victory. How sweet the rewards of peace.
a new panic is taking over in place of the old fears of venereal disease, and the media blames a lack of supervision. At the same time, military training camps move their projectors into classrooms, where teachers show teens films about dating and marriage.
Tonight, the feeling between us kept getting stronger and stronger.
The most popular one, maybe even infamous, comes out in 1947.
When does human growth begin?
Human Growth is the first film about reproduction to be shown in public schools for students as young as 11. Life magazine writes a 5-page spread, calling it an epic-making movie. A psychology professor at the University of Oregon wrote the film, but after an outcry from parents, it's banned in parts of the US.
One of the things you'll hear, especially historians and social scientists say, is that the United States is all about the individual. And over there in Europe, they're much more about the collective. On sex ed, it was the inverse. In the United States and also in the UK, sex ed was and continues to be oriented towards preventing bad collective outcomes. But in Northern Europe, especially Scandinavia, they developed a sex ed with a very different goal, which is to help each individual lead what they called a healthy or a pleasurable sexual life.
In 1955, Sweden becomes the first country to mandate sex ed in all of its schools. And 5 years later, the birth control pill hits the market. People are getting married later and having more sex.
I'm going to go all the way to that. I'm going to go all the way to that.
It absolutely changed the way Americans thought and acted around sex. And so I would say that what the pill did was it underscored and brought into relief some of these fundamental disagreements about what sex is and what it should be.
By 1964, teen pregnancies are on the rise, and Dr. Mary Calderone starts the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States. The group gets federal funding and distributes study guides about previously taboo topics like masturbation. Religious groups push back, and films like Perversion for Profit in 1965 warn audiences against this kind of deviance.
A flood tide of filth is engulfing our country in the form of newsstand obscenity and is threatening to pervert an entire generation of our American children.
In 1968, the Christian Crusade publishes this pamphlet that sells over 250,000 copies.
Oh my God!
But as the civil rights movement gains momentum, sex ed films get more bold and more inclusive. They start to feature homosexuality, feminism, and mixed-race couples. Meanwhile, overseas, sex and relationships education becomes a requirement in UK schools in 1976.
Okay, everyone, it's SRE question time. Okay.
And the World Health Organization starts to weigh in too.
By the late 70s and early 80s, the WHO had targets for sex ed. By the turn of the century, I guess, 80% of humanity will have the opportunity to lead a healthy sexual life. To which Zimmerman basically replies, WTF. Like, what is that? Seriously, does that mean like you get a lot? Does that mean it feels really good?
People all over the world are asking the same question.
But what about pleasure? People don't always have sex to make a baby.
And the debate continues until...
With HIV/AIDS, that all changes. It makes everyone in every country in some ways a fan of sex ed. It's just that they want different kinds.
In 1981, President Ronald Reagan announces funding for abstinence-only sex ed in U.S. schools. Educators consider it a small win.
Remember, it is always your right to say no. Always.
Cool.
Here's what a lot of people don't understand. Abstinence education is sex education. It may not be very good sex education. I think most of it is not. But here's the historical point. It's brought to you by people who pre-HIV believed the school should have nothing to do with the subject.
And in 1986, a film called Sex, Drugs, and AIDS is shown in New York schools.
There's a lot of wrong information going around about AIDS, and that's dangerous.
Of course, the culture war doesn't stop in the 80s or 90s, and it's still happening today. But there's one really big difference.
It's so easy. All you do is point and click.
Can you explain what internet is?
The internet changes everything.
Like it or not, most of our young people are going to get most of their education from screens, not from schools, okay? And that is new, right, in the historical scheme. I'm much more inclined to take a kind of fight fire with fire approach here, which is if the internet is transmitting some bad messages, let's use the internet to transmit some better ones. In the United States, there are now these really interesting text messaging services. Instead of asking some other equally uninformed person, you actually text that to somebody who knows what they're talking about, and you get a reply. That's sex education, and I would argue it's excellent sex education.
You guys are actually really good at giving out sex advice.
For the love of God, please go and talk about contraception to a sexual health professional. There's a sexual health clinic on Mayfield Road. Oh, yeah, thanks.